Last week we talked about how Romans begins with identity before instruction. And honestly, tonight we're going to stay right in the introduction. We're going to only get up through verse 15 tonight, just because I think it's important to kind of set the stage for the rest of the book before we get into it. But last week, again, we talked about identity before instruction. Paul doesn't start by telling people what to do. He doesn't open with commands. He doesn't open with corrections. Now, we have seen that in some of his other writings, right? But he begins by reminding people who they are, who they belong to, how they've been called, and what God has already done in their lives. Now, that matters for a letter like Romans, because Romans is not light reading. It's dense. There's a lot of theology in this letter. There are ideas that he presents that require a lot of attention and patience. And these are kind of the passages that people can feel intimidated by, and a lot of times people will just avoid it altogether. But Paul isn't writing in this letter like someone who is trying to deliver a lecture. He's writing like a pastor who actually cares about the people who are going to hear this when this letter is read out loud. So tonight we're gonna slow down, not because it's just introductory material that we got to get through, but because we really need to set the stage, like I said. But because before Paul ever explains the gospel in detail, we'll get into that beginning next week, but he spends time just talking about people. He talks about the church in Rome. He talks about his relationship to them. He talks about why he's thankful, why he wants to see them, and what he hopes might happen when they're actually together. And all of that happens before he ever makes a single theological argument. And that's worth noting. And it's worth remembering who Paul is writing to here. I mentioned it last week. He's not writing to a single congregation he founded. Like the way he did when he writes the letter to Corinth or Philippi. He's writing to believers who are scattered throughout the city of Rome, people who came together through faith through a variety of different paths, many of whom he's never actually met personally. So there isn't one shared story that Paul has between him and this group that he's writing to. There aren't memories of ministry together or moments that he can point back to. So when Paul writes, he's stepping into a community of believers that he cares about, but that he hasn't actually directly shepherded. And that makes the way he begins even more telling. This isn't Paul writing to close friends. And Rome itself wasn't an easy place to be a Christian. This was the center of power in the Roman Empire. Political authority, cultural influence, and social pressure all flowed out from this city. Faith there didn't stay private for very long. Allegiance always showed up in visible ways. So the church itself was made up of people from, like we talked about last week, from a variety of different backgrounds. Some grew up with the scripture, what we know as the Old Testament, right? Some didn't. Some had long religious histories. Others were still learning what faith in Jesus even meant. So when Paul writes, he's stepping into a complicated situation, not just culturally, but relationally. And the way he steps into it tells us a lot about what the gospel has already done in his life. Instead of leading with authority, Paul begins with gratitude. And instead of presenting himself as one who has everything to offer, he talks about encouragement flowing both ways. Now, that doesn't happen by accident. We know how easy it is for faith to become something private in our life. We know how quickly belief can turn into something individual instead of something that is shared in community. We've all seen how knowledge, when it's disconnected from relationship, can actually create space instead of connection. But these verses that we're going to look at tonight help us to see that the gospel doesn't just shape what Paul believes. It shapes how he approaches people. It affects the way he speaks, the way he relates to people, and the way he carries the responsibility that he has. Again, before Paul ever lays out the gospel in full, we're going to pay attention to how the gospel has already shaped him. So tonight we're going to be back in Romans chapter 1. We're going to be looking at verses 8 through 15. And as we read this passage tonight, I want you to listen for gratitude. Listen for longing. Listen for prayer as we read through this. So I'm just going to read through it, and then we'll circle back around and dive into it a little more. So beginning in verse number 8, it says, "First I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayer, making request if by some means now at last I might find a way in the will of God to come to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift, so that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith both of you and me. Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, just as among the other Gentiles. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. So as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also." Now that's the whole section we're gonna look at tonight. So I want to go back and look at it just kind of one piece at a time. And if we look at verse 8 again, especially that very first part where Paul opens this part of the letter with a simple sentence. It says this, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world." Now that word there that he starts with, first, that word first tells us where Paul naturally begins. Before he explains anything, before he addresses anything complicated, he chooses to start with gratitude. First, I thank. And it's worth paying attention to who that gratitude is directed to. Paul doesn't say he's thankful to the church. He says he's thankful to God for the church. That tells us something about how Paul understands their faith. He doesn't speak as if this community has managed to hold things together through sheer effort. He speaks as someone who believes God is actively sustaining what he started among them. That way of seeing faith shapes everything that follows. It's especially noticeable when you remember that Paul didn't plant this church. And he has never visited like a local church there. There's no personal history there. There's no shared experiences he can lean on. And in the ancient world, that kind of distance usually meant you needed to establish credibility early in a letter. You remind people who you were and why your words carry weight. But Paul chooses a different approach here. He starts by acknowledging what God is already doing among them. That immediately changes the tone. Instead of sounding like someone who's arriving to evaluate a situation from the outside, Paul sounds like someone who assumes God has been at work long before his letter arrived. That's an important way to read Romans. Paul is going to speak clearly and directly later in the letter, but he never begins from a place of suspicion. He begins here from a place of trust. Then Paul says something that can sound overstated if we don't slow down with it. He tells them that their faith is being spoken of throughout the world. Now, he's not talking about global recognition in the way we think about it today. He's talking about the known Roman world, right, around the Mediterranean. Rome was a city that people passed through constantly. Merchants, soldiers, and officials, they moved in and out of Rome, and news traveled with them. Stories did too. And in the middle of that, this church had become known for its faith. Not because it was powerful or because it was influential, but because it endured. Rome was not an easy place to follow Jesus. Faith there, again, didn't stay private. And again, I'll say it again, allegiance showed up in visible ways, and following Jesus meant navigating pressure and expectations that didn't go away quietly. So when Paul affirms their faith, he's recognizing something very real. He's acknowledging faith that didn't disappear when things became complicated. He does that before addressing anything else. Now, that order that he lists this out tells us something about Paul, about the way he thinks. He affirms what God is doing before he talks about what still needs to grow, before he talks about the areas that still need growth. And he's not avoiding those things. It's just wisdom. Now then, Paul shares something very personal, and he tells them that he's been praying for them continually. Now, it may just sound like a throwaway line, right? But it's doing something important, some important work in this letter. Paul has not been present with them. He hasn't preached there or walked with them face to face. And again, in this time, in this ancient world of Rome, distance like that could easily be interpreted as disengagement. Silence could feel like indifference. So Paul here, by saying this, that he's been praying for them, he closes the gap by letting them see what has been happening behind the scenes. He's been carrying them before God. He's been taking them before the Lord. That tells us, again, something important about how Paul understands leadership and care. Presence is not limited to geography. Prayer is not secondary work. It's real participation in what God is doing. Paul trusts, now from like our perspective, this fits naturally with how we understand life in the Spirit, right? We believe the Spirit works beyond physical proximity. We believe prayer connects people across distance in real ways. Paul trusts that same Spirit who called these believers is still sustaining these believers, even if he's not there. And that trust that he has shapes the way he speaks to them. He doesn't come across as guarded. He doesn't hold them out at arm's length. He begins by expressing gratitude for what God is already doing there in them. He's trying to make a connection with them there, because he doesn't have that history like he has in these other churches. In the churches that he planted, he can just go in and be like direct, right? But here he's setting the stage. So Romans will go on to address sin. It'll address righteousness. It'll address salvation. It'll address life in Christ. But it starts here with a pastor acknowledging God's work that's happening in these people that he hasn't even met yet. He doesn't do it accidentally. It's very intentional the way he's starting this letter. And it tells us a lot about the gospel that Paul is going to explain in the next chapters. So if we look back at verses 11 and 12, he says, "For I long to see you." So after Paul expresses gratitude, he moves into something more personal. He tells them, listen, there's this desire that is within me to see you. And that word is doing more than we might notice at first. Paul isn't talking about logistics. He's not talking about a ministry opportunity or a strategic stop along the way. He's talking about desire. He wants to be with them. And that's important because Paul could have written this very differently. By this point in his ministry, Paul does have authority. He may not have met them, but they know who he is. His teaching carries weight. His voice is respected across the churches throughout this whole Mediterranean region. If he wanted to sound formal, he could have done that without anyone questioning who he thought he was. But instead, in this passage, he's choosing this relational language. He wants them to know this letter isn't coming from someone who is detached. It's coming from someone who cares. Paul then says something that can be easy to misunderstand if we read it too quickly. He tells them that he wants to impart some spiritual gift so that they may be strengthened. And almost immediately he clarifies what he means. He says that what he's really talking about is mutual encouragement. Faith strengthening faith. Paul doesn't want anyone to hear that first phrase and assume he's positioning himself as the one with everything to give. He's also saying, listen, this goes both ways. He doesn't want to position himself as the only one to give and them as the only one to receive. So he slows it down and he explains himself. He's not coming to fix them. He's not coming to correct them from a distance. He's coming because he believes something happens when believers come together. Paul expects to give, but Paul also expects to receive. That's a revealing moment in this. And oftentimes in these introductions, we just kind of read through them and we're like, oh, he's just kind of saying, hey, I'm Paul, I'm praying for you. But all of this language is very important, the way that he's laying it out. Paul doesn't think spiritual maturity means independence. He doesn't believe growth leads to self-sufficiency. For Paul, maturity means dependence. Not just on God, but on the body of Christ. Paul understands the power of community. Now that idea runs against a lot of our natural instincts, though. We often assume that needing encouragement means something is wrong in our life. That if we were stronger, if we were more mature, if we were more disciplined, we wouldn't need other people in the same way. But that's not true, and Paul doesn't see it that way either. He assumes that faith is strengthened in community, that encouragement is not a sign of weakness, but it's a normal part of spiritual life. And he uses that word mutual on purpose. Paul doesn't believe that the Spirit works through one person alone. He believes the Spirit works through the gathered body. Strength doesn't flow just in one direction, unless, of course, you're talking about from the Lord, right? It moves back and forth as believers share life together. We can all attest to that, right? We've all been strengthened by one another. This also fits naturally with how we understand the spiritual gifts in the life of the church. We believe the Spirit distributes different gifts throughout the body. We expect the Spirit to work through the pastor, absolutely, yes. But we also believe that he works through all believers as they encourage one another. Paul is not minimizing leadership here, but he is giving us a clearer picture of it. Leadership doesn't mean being the only source of strength in the room. It means helping create space where faith can strengthen faith. Paul believes that when believers are together, the Spirit is at work in them. It does not happen in isolation. We can all look back probably over our life at different points where we've maybe pulled back and we've isolated ourselves. And we're not strengthened in those moments. It actually weakens us. It's something we all recognize, but we don't always name it though, right? Most people don't drift away from faith because they lose information. They drift because they lose connection. Faith carried alone eventually becomes heavy. It just becomes knowledge, right? Paul understands that. That's why he wants to be present with them, not just to write to them, but literally with them. When he talks about imparting a spiritual gift, he's not promising something dramatic or sensational here. He's talking about strengthening what already exists, about stabilizing faith, about encouraging endurance, about helping the church stay grounded. He's not trying to impress them here. He's trying to walk with them. Paul doesn't approach the Roman church as a problem to solve or some kind of project that he needs to manage. He approaches them as people he believes the Spirit is working in. That's what pastoral longing looks like. That's what he's talking about when he says, I long to be with you. And that setup, it prepares us for what comes next. because Paul's desire to be with them leads directly into the question that they're probably already asking. If he feels this way, why hasn't he already come? So in verse number 13, he says this, "Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, just as among the other Gentiles." So at this point in the letter, Paul knows there's this unspoken question sitting in the room, right? Hey, you said you longed to come and see us, but we haven't seen you yet. You know, it's easy to say that, but where have you been? So he's not just going to pretend that question is not there. He addresses it head on. So he's talked about gratitude. He's talked about prayer. He's talked about longing and shared encouragement. And so that obvious question becomes, if Paul feels this way about the church in the Rome, why hasn't he showed up? He doesn't ignore it, right? Sometimes we just ignore the hard questions, but instead of ignoring the hard question, he names it. He tells them that he's often planned to come, but up till now he's been hindered. And that word helps us to understand how Paul views what's happened. He's not describing reluctance or uncertainty. He's describing interruption. His plans were real. His desire was real. Something else simply intervened. That's an important distinction because Paul doesn't want the Roman believers filling in the blanks on their own. In the ancient world, distance could easily be misread. If someone didn't come when they said they would come, it would be taken personally. Same with us, right? If someone tells us they're gonna come and they don't, whether it's maybe a party that we're holding or a get-together, a family gathering, a church gathering, whatever it may be, they tell us they're gonna come and they don't show up, our feelings can get hurt, right? And that's what he's really addressing here. He knows that. Silence could feel like rejection. Paul knows how easily assumptions form in the absence of clarity. So he explains himself. His delay wasn't about a lack of care. It wasn't about changing priorities. Keep in mind, he couldn't pick up the phone and say, "Hey, guess what? I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to make it." See, today, people don't have any excuse, do they? I mean, they can let you know if they're not going to show up, right? All right, anyhow. So he explains himself here. His delay wasn't about lack of care. It wasn't about changing priorities. It wasn't about hesitation toward the church in Rome. He loved the church in Rome. He cared for the church in Rome. He just frames it as redirection. And that tells us something about how Paul understands obedience as well. Paul doesn't assume that wanting something deeply means it should happen immediately. He doesn't equate sincerity with speed. He leaves room for God to shape timing. Sometimes we feel like we got to do something immediately, but sometimes God causes a reason for it not to happen right then, even when the desire for something is good. And it's not easy, is it? Most of us struggle with waiting. Does anybody in here like to wait? There ain't nothing like just standing in line. Just love to do that, right? We are far more comfortable with action than delay. When something doesn't move forward, we tend to question whether it was right to begin with. Paul's not thinking that way, though. He allows for the possibility that God's will includes interruption. And then Paul explains why he wants to come at all. He says he wants to have some fruit among them, just as he had among other Gentiles. And that word fruit here, especially in a letter that's eventually going to talk so much about righteousness, faith, and life in Christ, is very important. Paul isn't talking about numbers here. He's not measuring success by visible outcomes or quick results. In Scripture, fruit usually points to something that develops over time. Growth that takes roots. Faith that matures. Lives that change gradually over time. We want to see immediate success, right? That's what we want. But that's not what Paul is even showing us here. Paul isn't in a hurry to pass through Rome and move on. He's interested in something that lasts. And notice how he phrases it. He talks about fruit among them, not fruit from them. That tells us how Paul views the church. He's not treating the Roman believers as a resource to be used or a means to advance his mission. He is invested in what God is doing within the community itself. And that's got to shape how we read the rest of this letter. Paul isn't writing to get something out of the Roman church. He's writing because he believes the gospel produces real transformation over time, and he wants to see that work continue among them. That also helps us understand why Paul is willing to wait. If you're only interested in quick results, delay will feel like failure. But if you truly believe that God works over time, patience becomes part of faithfulness. Paul trusts that when the gospel takes root, it produces fruit in its own season. And that confidence shapes the way he approaches the people. He doesn't rush them. He doesn't pressure them. He doesn't treat delay as loss. He believes God is at work even when plans don't unfold as expected. And that kind of trust prepares us for what Paul says next, because the same gospel that teaches patience also creates a sense of responsibility, and that's where he turns in the next verses. In verses 14 and 15, he says, I'm a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. So as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. Paul closes this opening section by using a word that can sound uncomfortable if we hear it in our modern ears. He says, he is under obligation. And of course, some translations, like the one we just read, use the word debtor. Either way, it's not language we naturally reach for, is it? It can sound negative, as if Paul's talking about pressure or guilt. But that's not how Paul's using this word here. He's not saying he owes something because he failed. He's not describing a burden that he wishes he didn't have to carry. He's talking about responsibility that comes from having been entrusted with something valuable. Paul understands the gospel as something that was given to him, not something he arrived at on his own. He didn't reason his way into it. He didn't earn it by being faithful enough. He didn't achieve it through discipline or obedience. He didn't earn it because he gave a certain amount of tithe or nothing like that. It came to him as grace. And because it came to him as grace, Paul understands that it was never meant to stop with him. That's why he says he's obligated to Greeks and barbarians, to the wise and to the foolish. That language covers everyone Paul can think of. It crosses cultural boundaries, it crosses educational differences, and it crosses social categories. Paul doesn't divide people into those who are ready for the gospel and those who are not. He doesn't sort the world into people who deserve effort and people who don't. The gospel does not allow him to do that. Paul doesn't see himself as standing above people because he knows the gospel. He sees himself as responsible to people because the gospel was entrusted to him. He is a debtor to it. That's a subtle distinction, but it changes everything. He doesn't say he's obligated over them. He says he's obligated to them. In other words, that the gospel hasn't elevated him above others. It has placed him in service to others. For Paul, grace never produces superiority. It produces responsibility. And then Paul says something that might surprise us if we're not paying attention. He says he's eager to preach the gospel to those who are already believers in Rome. Not outsiders, not unbelievers, the church. That tells us something important about Paul, how he understands the gospel. Paul doesn't see the gospel as something you graduate from. He doesn't treat it like the entry point to faith and then something you move past as you mature. For Paul, the gospel is not just how faith begins, it's how faith continues. It shapes how believers grow. It shapes how they endure. It shapes how they remain grounded over time. Even mature believers need to hear it again. That's why Paul is eager. Not because the Roman church has failed, not because something has gone wrong, and not even because they're behind where they should be, but because the gospel continues to form people long after the beginning. Paul ends this section not with pressure, but with readiness. He's ready to come when God opens the door. He's ready to serve. He's ready to share the same gospel that first changed him. And this is where the letter begins to turn. Because the gospel Paul is eager to preach to believers is the gospel he's about to explain in deep detail. Everything up to this point has been relational. Gratitude, prayer, longing, patience, responsibility. But now Paul is ready to tell us why the gospel has power to do all of that. And that's where we'll be headed in these next weeks. But we had to start with this introduction. I know we've walked 2 weeks through just this very intro, but it's so important to understand where Paul is coming from, who he's writing to, and what he truly believes. And we need to understand how Paul relates. Again, before he ever explains the gospel, he lets us see how the gospel has already shaped him, how gratitude has shaped him, or how the gospel has given him this gratitude, the desire to be with people that he's never met, the willingness to wait when plans don't work out, patience, how the gospel has formed patience within him, and how the gospel has given him this sense of responsibility that doesn't turn into pressure and it doesn't turn into pride. And all of that, every bit of that comes before he ever tells us what the gospel is. So hopefully we get this and it's worth sitting with so that we truly understand where he goes next.